The guy in the $1,000 sparring gear thought he was picking on a broken-down cowboy. He saw dirt-stained boots, graying hair, and silence. He didn't see the muscle memory forged in Fallujah. He didn't know. Some men don't boast about violence. They just keep it locked in a cage. The barbed wire snapped tight with the sound of a plucked guitar string. Arthur Hayes held the tension with a heavy leather glove, feeling the vibration travel up his forearm. Sweat tracked through the dust on his neck. It was 92 degrees in Bitter Creek, Montana, and the sun felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Arthur twisted the wire tie, clamped it down with his pliers, and let out a slow breath. He was 51 years old. His back ached on rainy days, and his left knee carried a titanium pin that set off airport metal detectors. Not that he ever flew anywhere anymore. He owned 300 acres of dry, unforgiving earth. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. That quiet had a price, and lately, the price was going up. A cloud of white dust billowed on the horizon, moving fast down the county road. Arthur didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on the fence line, checking the spacing of the cedar posts. The vehicle was moving entirely too fast for a dirt road heavily rutted by winter runoff. The engine whine was high-pitched, expensive, German engineering out of place in a landscape built on diesel and rust. A matte black G-Wagon skidded to a halt near Arthur's rusted Ford O2E-O. The dust washed over Arthur's truck, coating the faded red paint in a thick layer of white powder. Arthur slowly placed his pliers in his leather tool pouch. He didn't brush the dust off his shirt. He just waited. The driver's door opened, and Weston Carmichael stepped out. Weston was 32, built like a fitness magazine cover, and possessed the kind of restless, aggressive energy that came from never being told no. He had made his money in tech, cashed out early, and decided he wanted to play cowboy. He bought the 2,000 acres bordering Arthur's land, erected a mansion of glass and steel on the highest ridge, and converted an old barn into a state-of-the-art mixed martial arts facility. Weston was a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He made sure everyone in Bitter Creek knew it within 48 hours of moving to town. "Hayes!" Weston called out, slamming the heavy door of the SUV. He marched over, his custom-made, spotless ostrich skin boots crunching against the gravel. He wore compression shorts, a tight black rash guard, and designer sunglasses. Arthur rested his forearms on the top wire of the fence. "Carmichael, you ignored my lawyer's letter," Weston said. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a nod. He just closed the distance, standing a little too close, leaning into Arthur's space. It was a fighter's habit, dominate the center of the ring. "I didn't ignore it," Arthur said, his voice a low, even gravel. "I threw it away." Weston smiled, but the edges of his mouth were tight. "Look, old man, that access road cuts right through the southeast corner of my property. I'm paving it. I'm putting up a gate. You need to use the county highway from now on." "Deed says I have an easement," Arthur said softly. "Has for 60 years. "I don't care what a piece of paper from 1960 says," Weston snapped, pulling his sunglasses down slightly to glare over the rims. "I'm developing that quadrant. I've got sparring partners flying in from Vegas next week. I can't have your noisy, leaky piece of garbage truck rattling past my facility every morning at 5 a.m. "Truck doesn't leak," Arthur said. Weston scoffed, shaking his head. He looked Arthur up and down, taking in the faded Wrangler shirt, the sweat-stained Stetson, the worn hands. Weston saw a relic. He saw weakness. "I offered you 10 grand for the easement rights. That's generous, more than generous. Take the check, Hayes, because the gate is going up Friday. If you try to drive through, I'll have you trespassed." Arthur stared at Weston. He didn't look at the younger man's eyes. He looked at his chest, his shoulders, the placement of his feet. It wasn't a conscious calculation. It was a diagnostic scan running in the background of a hard drive that had never fully been wiped. Weston's weight was shifted forward, heavy on the lead leg. His chin was up, arrogant, exposed. Fence makes a good neighbor, Arthur said finally, turning back to his tool pouch. Gate just makes a prisoner. I'll be using the road Friday, Weston. Same as always. Weston's face flushed. The vein in his neck pulsed. He was used to lawyers. He was used to boardrooms where he could shout people down, or mats where he could choke them into submission. He wasn't used to a man turning his back on him. You're making a mistake, Hayes, Weston said, his voice dropping an octave, trying to mimic a menace he hadn't earned. I'm not one of these local hicks you can just stubborn your way around. You don't know who you're dealing with. Arthur picked up his post-hole digger. He didn't look back. Have a good afternoon, Weston. Weston stood there for a long 5 seconds, the silence stretching out, making him look foolish. He cursed under his breath, spun around, and marched back to his G-Wagon. He tore out onto the dirt shoulder, throwing a spray of gravel that dinged against the side of Arthur's truck. Arthur didn't flinch. He just watched the dust settle, then went back to work. The diner in town smelled of burnt coffee and old frying oil. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet that settled over Bitter Creek when the tourists were gone and the locals were just trying to get through the week. Arthur sat in the back booth. He ordered the meatloaf. He always ordered the meatloaf. He sat facing the door. He always sat facing the door. The bell above the entrance jingled violently. The heavy glass door swung open, and the quiet of the diner shattered. Weston Carmichael walked in, trailed by 3 younger men. They were all built like blockhouses, wearing athletic gear branded with Weston's private ranch logo. They were loud. They laughed with their chests, taking up all the oxygen in the room. They had just finished a heavy sparring session, high on adrenaline and their own perceived invincibility. The waitress, a 60-year-old woman named Patty, stiffened behind the counter. She grabbed a coffee pot, her knuckles white on the handle. Weston slapped a $50 bill on the counter. Protein shakes for my guys, Patty. Whatever you got, extra eggs. He didn't look at her. He was already scanning the room, his eyes locked onto the back booth. A cruel, sharp grin spread across Weston's face. He patted one of his buddies on the shoulder and jerked his chin toward Arthur. The pack moved through the diner, weaving between the empty tables until they surrounded Arthur's booth. Arthur kept eating. He cut a piece of meatloaf, chased it with a sip of black coffee. He didn't look up. Boys, Weston said, leaning against the edge of Arthur's table, I want you to meet my neighbor. This is Arthur Hayes. He's a big fan of historical fiction, specifically old property deeds. The 3 sycophants chuckled. One of them, a thick-necked guy with a cauliflower ear, cracked his knuckles. How's the fence coming, old man? Weston asked. It's holding, Arthur said quietly. He placed his fork down on the porcelain plate. The tiny clink was swallowed by the ambient hum of the diner's refrigerators, but to Arthur, it sounded like a hammer strike. I heard you went to the sheriff about my gate, Weston said, his tone mocking. Sheriff told you it was a civil matter, didn't he? Told you to get a lawyer. But we both know you can't afford a lawyer, Hayes. You can barely afford that slop you're eating. Arthur picked up a napkin. He wiped his mouth. You're standing in my light, Weston. The diner went dead silent. The 2 old men at the counter stopped chewing. Patty froze with the coffee pot midair. Weston's smile vanished. The disrespect was too naked, too public. His ego, fragile and inflated by the yes-men surrounding him, couldn't take it. You've got a lot of nerve, Weston hissed, slamming both palms down on the tabletop. The coffee in Arthur's mug sloshed over the rim, staining the white formica. I'm trying to drag this dead-end town into the 21st century. I'm bringing money here. I'm bringing prestige. And you're just standing in the dirt clutching a piece of paper. Arthur looked at the spilled coffee. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes. He didn't glare. He didn't scowl. His expression was entirely devoid of emotion. It was a flat, dead stare. It was the look of a man evaluating a structurally unsound building before demolition. You bring money, Arthur said, his voice so quiet, Weston had to lean in to hear it. You bring noise, but you don't bring respect, and you don't own the road. Weston snorted, standing up straight. He looked at his friends, playing to his audience. Respect? You think you deserve respect because you're old and you shovel manure? Respect is earned, Hayes. Weston tapped his own chest. I'm a third-degree black belt. I've competed in Abu Dhabi. I've choked out guys twice your size. You want respect? You step onto a mat and you take it. I don't play games on mats, Arthur said. Because you can't, Weston shot back. He reached out and grabbed the salt shaker from Arthur's table, tossing it casually in the air and catching it. You're a fossil. You hide behind the sheriff and your rusty truck because you're weak. If you were a real man, you wouldn't need a deed to protect your property. You'd protect it yourself. Arthur looked at the salt shaker in Weston's hand. Put that down. Or what? Weston challenged. He dropped the salt shaker into Arthur's half-eaten meatloaf. It sank into the gravy. Patty gasped. The thick-necked friend laughed. Arthur stared at the ruined meal. He didn't sigh. He didn't yell. The silence in him just grew deeper, heavier. It was a terrifying kind of stillness. It was the calm of the ocean drawing back right before a tsunami hits the shoreline. Arthur slid out of the booth. He stood up. He was 2 inches shorter than Weston and 30 pounds lighter. He didn't puff out his chest. He stood perfectly balanced, his weight evenly distributed, his arms hanging loose at his sides. You owe Patty for the food, Arthur said. Weston laughed in his face. I'll buy the whole diner if I want to. Arthur reached into his front pocket, pulled out a worn leather money clip, and dropped a $10 bill on the table. He stepped past Weston, intentionally brushing his shoulder against the younger man's chest. It wasn't a shove. It was an assertion of space. Weston grabbed Arthur's shoulder. I'm not done talking to you, Weston barked. The moment Weston's fingers closed around the denim of Arthur's shirt, the air in the diner fractured. Arthur didn't pull away. He didn't throw a punch. In a movement so fast and fluid it barely registered to the naked eye, Arthur turned his torso, shifting his center of gravity. His right hand snapped up, his fingers clamping onto Weston's wrist. He didn't squeeze. He applied precise, localized pressure to the radial nerve. Weston's grip on the shirt vanished instantly. A sharp, involuntary gasp escaped the younger man's lips as his knees buckled a fraction of an inch. His hand went completely numb. Arthur held him there for 1 second, 2 seconds. The 3 sycophants didn't even have time to react. Then Arthur let go. Weston stumbled backward, clutching his wrist against his chest, his eyes wide with sudden, uncomprehending shock. The numbness was fading, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache that radiated up to his elbow. He looked at Arthur, trying to process what had just happened. It shouldn't have been possible. The old man hadn't even looked like he was trying. Arthur adjusted his collar. Don't touch me again. The humiliation hit Weston like a physical blow. The shock evaporated, instantly incinerated by white-hot rage. His friends were watching. The whole diner was watching. He, the black belt, the apex predator of his own manufactured world, had just been swatted away like a nuisance by a man who looked like he bought his clothes at a Tractor Supply store. You old piece of trash, Weston spat, his face purple. He dropped into a fighting stance, his hands coming up, chin tucked. You want a sucker punch? Let's go. Right here. Arthur looked at Weston's stance. He saw the technical proficiency, the high guard, the bladed posture. It was textbook. It was perfect for a referee, a padded floor, and a timer. I didn't punch you, Arthur said. I asked you to stop touching me. You're dead, Weston said, taking a step forward, closing the distance. The thick-necked friend stepped in, grabbing Weston's shoulder. Hey, West, chill out. Not in here. The sheriff will revoke the gym's business license if you bash a local in a diner. Weston shrugged him off violently, but he stopped moving forward. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving under the tight black shirt. He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur. "You think you're tough because you know a parlor trick?" Weston yelled, his voice cracking slightly with adrenaline. "You think you can embarrass me in front of these people?" "You embarrassed yourself, son," Arthur said. "Friday," Weston snarled, ignoring him. "The town's Founders' Day festival. They set up a boxing ring by the fairgrounds for charity exhibitions every year. You and me, 3 rounds. Or do you only fight when people aren't looking?" Arthur turned toward the door. "I don't fight for charity, and I don't fight for fun. If you don't show up," Weston projected his voice to ensure everyone in the diner heard, "I won't just put a gate on that road. I'll buy the bank that holds the note on your miserable ranch, and I will foreclose on you. I will bury you in legal fees until you're living in that rusted truck. You show up Friday, or I take everything you have." Arthur stopped with his hand on the heavy glass door. He looked out into the parking lot. The sun had set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. He had spent 20 years in the shadows. He had done things in the dark corners of the world that woke him up in cold sweats. He had traded his youth, his peace of mind, and very nearly his soul to ensure he would never have to be violent again. He had built a life of quiet routine precisely because he knew what he was capable of when the routine broke. Weston wasn't just threatening his land. He was threatening the cage Arthur had built to keep the monster inside. Arthur slowly turned around. He looked past the 3 heavy hitters. He looked past Patty holding the coffee pot. He looked directly into Weston Carmichael's eyes. The flat, dead stare was gone. In its place was something infinitely worse. It was focus. "Friday," Arthur said. The word dropped like an anvil in the quiet room. 3 rounds. Without waiting for a response, Arthur pushed the door open and walked out into the cool evening air. Inside the diner, nobody spoke. Weston lowered his hands, a triumphant sneer returning to his face. He looked at his friends. "I'm going to kill him," he whispered. But as the thick-necked friend watched the taillights of Arthur's rusty Ford pull out of the parking lot, he couldn't shake the sudden cold knot forming in his stomach. He had seen the look in the old man's eyes. It wasn't the look of a man who was afraid of a fight. It was the look of a man who was already deciding where to bury the body. The Bitter Creek Founders' Day Festival smelled of deep-fried dough, diesel exhaust, and livestock. It was a makeshift carnival erected on the dirt lots behind the high school football field. A row of rickety Ferris wheels spun against the black Montana sky, casting long, dizzying shadows across the gravel. At the far end of the fairgrounds, away from the petting zoo and the beer tent, they had set up the ring. It wasn't a professional cage. It was a raised platform of plywood covered in heavy blue canvas, surrounded by 4 thick ropes. Halogen work lights on aluminum tripods glared down from the 4 corners, baking the canvas in harsh, unforgiving white light. Moths swarmed the bulbs in a frantic, blinding snowstorm. By 8 o'clock, half the town had crowded around the platform. Word had spread. It wasn't just a charity exhibition anymore. It was a public execution. The rich outsider who bought half the valley was finally going to put the town's quietest hermit in the hospital. People dragged aluminum lawn chairs from their pickup trucks. They stood on the beds of their Silverados, holding cheap domestic beers, waiting for blood. Weston Carmichael arrived like a prizefighter, stepping into Madison Square Garden. A portable speaker blasted heavy bass as he parted the crowd. He wore a custom silk robe over his fight trunks, his gym's logo emblazoned in gold across his back. His 3 sycophants flanked him, carrying water bottles, towels, and a tub of petroleum jelly. Weston bounced on the balls of his feet, shadowboxing, throwing crisp, lightning-fast combinations into the humid air. The crowd murmured. Some cheered, most just stared, intimidated by the sheer naked aggression of the man. Weston vaulted over the top rope. He landed lightly on the canvas, raised both arms, and let out a primal yell. The halogen lights caught the sheen of sweat on his heavily muscled shoulders. He looked invincible. Arthur Hayes drove up in his rusted F250. He didn't park near the ring. He parked out by the county highway in the dark and walked the quarter-mile to the fairgrounds alone. He wore the same faded Wrangler jeans he wore to fix the fence, paired with a plain gray cotton t-shirt. He carried a roll of standard white athletic tape in his left hand. No gym bag, no entourage, no music. The crowd parted for him differently than they had for Weston. They didn't cheer, they just fell silent. The locals had known Arthur for 20 years, but none of them actually knew him. He bought his feed, paid his taxes, and minded his business. Seeing him walk toward the lights, his face cast in stone, made people uncomfortable. They felt like they were watching a man walk to the gallows. Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache who had reluctantly agreed to referee the bout, met Arthur at the edge of the platform. "Arthur," Miller said, his voice low, troubled, "you don't have to die of this. I can shut this down right now. Call it a hazard. I know what he threatened regarding your property. We can fight that in court." Arthur stopped at the base of the wooden stairs. He looked up at the ring. Weston was pacing like a caged tiger, glaring down at him, pounding his 4-ounce MMA gloves together. "Court takes years, Sheriff," Arthur said flatly. "This takes 3 rounds." Arthur walked up the steps and ducked between the ropes. The canvas was soft under his boots. He hadn't taken his boots off. Weston laughed out loud, pointing across the ring. "You're fighting in shit kickers? Are you insane, old man? I'm going to break your legs." Arthur didn't answer. He walked to his corner. There was no stool. He just stood facing the center of the ring, unspooling the athletic tape. He wrapped his hands himself. It was a slow, methodical process. Figure 8 around the knuckles, lock the thumb, anchor the wrist. The movements were so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that his eyes never left Weston. Arthur's gaze was empty. The lights, the noise, the crowd, none of it registered. He was descending into a very dark, very quiet room in his mind. He was unlocking a door he had welded shut in a desert 2 decades ago. Sheriff Miller called them to the center of the ring